Welcome to the Prep Athletics Podcast. This is Corey Heights.
Some battles. I'm not sure if they got us. If they did, maybe.
So you will get better as a player during that year.
So it was kind of exciting. Like, oh yeah, somebody wants me.
Welcome to the Prep Athletics Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Heights, and I am the founder and president of Prep Athletics. And on today's episode, we have a great guest, and we're going to learn a lot about the prep school consultant world. And we're talking to this man because he is an expert in the field. He went to a prep school, he's worked at prep schools, and now he helps families from around the world find the right prep schools. We're going to be talking to him. We're going to be talking about the benefits of an educational consultant, such as him and such as hiring someone like myself in prep athletics. And we're going to give out tips to help players choose the right prep school at the right price and much, much more. So my guest today is Chris Overbye. He is a partner and educational consultant from Hunnewell Education, which is based out of the Boston, Massachusetts area. He's worked over 10 years as a prep school educational consultant. His prior school experience includes working for 19 years as, get this, a director of admissions, a director of financial aid, and a development director at boarding and day schools throughout New England, to include Lawrence Academy, Dexter Southfield Schools, and the Salisbury School. During his 19-year career in boarding and day schools, he's taught English. He's a coach as well. He's coached basketball and baseball, and he served as a personal student advisor to over 90 students. Chris is a graduate of Allegheny College, and on average, each year he'll work with about 30 to 35 kids. So, Chris Overbye, welcome very much to the podcast.
Thanks, Corey. Nice to be here. It's a little chilly here on the East Coast, but enjoying a nice day.
Yeah,
the weather.
Our last podcast was with the head coach, Chad Myers of IMG Academy. So he's down at 80 degrees.
Oh, geez.
And it was
jealous.
It was a blizzard back here in the background behind me. So, but just let everyone know, Chris and I have been friends now for years, and he is a vital resource for me. He answers some technical questions I have about the prep school world, and he's just a vital resource. And today's episode, I wanted to get away a little bit from talking to basketball coaches and talk to a guy who lives it and breathes it, and see if we can get as much information out to you guys as possible so you guys can make the right decision. And if you want to hire an educational consultant like Chris or hire a basketball placement consultant like Prep Athletics, that's fine. But 99% of the people don't do that. And we're going to give some reasons why maybe that could be a mistake or the benefit we can bring. So Chris, to start it off, just let me ask the $1 million question. Why hire you, or why hire Prep Athletics to be an educational prep school consultant?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually a question that I get asked frequently from families when they're calling or trying to learn a little bit more about the advantages or why they would work with a private school consultant. A lot of what I do is use the experience that I've had having worked in admissions to help families and advocate for students that are interested in looking at boarding schools. And from my standpoint, what I try to do is sort of set up some goals, talk about some of the advantages for schools, and really sort of act as an advisor or coach in the school application process and interview process with families and their sons or daughters.
Gotcha. Now, what I do when I see a basketball player, I look at their academics, I look at their athletics, and I see how good they are. And then we look at the financial profile that the family is willing to invest into, tuition each year at a prep school, whether it's post-grad or whether it's younger than that. And then I narrow down if it's a post-grad kid, the 100 prep school or post-grad basketball options down to about 3 to 5 schools for the kid. And if they're younger, that list could be 300 schools nationwide. And I narrow that down to 3 to 5 kids. How do you narrow down a family's, prep school choices from that giant number down to a few, if you're not doing basketball, maybe specifically?
Yeah, I mean, the important part of this process is sitting down with the parents as well as the student or athlete and getting a sense in terms of what they're looking for, their goals, whether it's playing basketball in college or athletics, at the high school level and beyond, but also looking at academic fit. And so whether it's the size of the school, for example, there's between the 350 boarding schools around the country, there are schools that are 300 students. There are schools that are 1,100, 1,200 students, and being able to sort of determine, number one, the right match for the student, what their expectations are, and where academically is going to be the best fit for that particular student athlete is really one of the ways that we start the process. I then continue it with having the students fill out a student questionnaire, which gives me more insight into sort of their personality as well as their interests. And then from there, really starting to look at specific programs athletically as well as academically to make sure that if they're going to look at a school, they know what they're going to see and be able to advocate for them once they're able to communicate with those schools. So you're right, it's the big challenge of going from, say, a school list of 20 to 25 to really more realistically 5 or 6 schools.
And what do you do specifically when you advocate for a family? Tell me about that.
Well, I'm fortunate enough because I've worked and lived at boarding schools and private schools for a number of years that I know a lot of these schools just from visiting their campuses. I know you have done as well. Meeting the faculty as well as understanding what their profile is and what types of students they work with is really important. And so when I advocate for a student, it's number one, communicating with the admissions office or directly with a specific sport, depending on my experience with that school. But most of the time it's communicating with an admissions office prior to a family visiting to give them a little bit of a baseline and profile of the student and the family.
Gotcha. Okay. And that comes in handy, doesn't it?
It does. It helps from the family standpoint, just because they get a better understanding of what to expect going into a school, especially in relationship to specific programs, specific coaches, which is really valuable, so that for a family to know the difference between one school in terms of their basketball program or lacrosse program is really valuable. And for me, I feel like, being able to communicate with a director of admissions or an associate director of admissions to give them a better understanding of the strengths of the student and the student athlete is really the most valuable part of what I do.
Yeah, perfect. I'm going to give a quick pitch to those that don't know how Prep Athletics and myself, how we work with students. So, I've got kids reaching out every day, especially now with COVID, from all over the world wanting to go to prep schools. And a lot of kids just don't pass the first test. One, they've got to have, and we're talking brick and mortar prep schools here. And you can listen to previous podcasts and learn the difference between a brick and mortar prep school and a basketball academy. But we're talking in this conversation, brick and mortar established prep schools. So I will look at a kid's athletics, see how good he is, see what his size is. I'll look at his academics, see where he stands in that reign. And then the family and I have to have a conversation about how much they're willing to invest in this year, which I mentioned earlier. So once we get all that figured out, once we figure out the family's goals and we decide to move forward in a partnership, then, like I said, I try to narrow down those schools to the right fitting ones. And some of the benefits of working with a Prep Athletics or working with Chris is that, just like he said, I've visited probably over 100 prep schools in person. I've placed kids at over 37 different prep schools, and I've been doing this since 2008. And then my previous podcast episode is my personal story. I did a post-grad year myself at a prep school before playing in a D1 program. My cousin Brad Miller, who was interviewed a few weeks ago, he attended his senior year at a New England prep school before playing 4 years at Purdue and 14 years in the NBA. So my family has actually benefited from it. He said many times he would not have played in the NBA without his prep school basketball experience. I would not have played D1 for free without my prep school years. So that's kind of what I can do to bring knowledge and advisory role to basketball families or athletic families as well. So just wanted to throw that out there as well. Let's talk about the next thing. With COVID going on right now, you're probably seeing a lot more people reaching out to you looking for advice and whatnot on this world. So how is the prep school world and you picking schools for folks or and everything, how has COVID changed your job, and what can you share with us that maybe families need to know about going down this route at this point in time?
Right, how schools are sort of handling it, and how it's affected sort of the application and admissions process for kids and student athletes. Yeah, it's really been an interesting year, because of the COVID impact. A lot more families that normally would not have considered private schools have considered private schools or applied late because of the fact that they felt like the COVID response in the public schools did not allow their sons or daughters to have the experience that they would want. And fortunately for the private boarding schools, a majority of them have been able to maintain a normal schedule and have been able to have their kids on campus. There are international students that are online still, just because of the travel restrictions and because of a 2 week 2 week time that they have to isolate before coming back to school. So those are some of the kids that are still at home, a lot of the international kids. But for a majority of the boarding schools, they've maintained a normal experience. And as a result, I think the schools have really had to sort of adapt. From an admissions standpoint, it's been a challenging because normally at this time of year in April, Corey, they would be having what we call revisit programs. So students that are accepted have a month to decide. April 10th is when they make their final decisions on schools, which is this Thursday. And so most of the boarding schools will host kids that have been accepted for revisit programs. And unfortunately, that has not been possible this year, even though the students are on campus. They just want to prevent any type of interaction between outside families and the current families that are on campus, just to prevent obviously the health concerns for those students that are currently at the schools. But it's made it harder for schools to try to determine how to market to the students, but also present their programs. And so now, this week, basically, schools are reaching out to the students, giving them opportunities to have online conversations with faculty and students, and then waiting to see what happens on April 10th in terms of which students are going to choose. So I think the challenge has obviously been the health restrictions and making sure that the spread of COVID is limited. But more importantly, I think for some families that are going through this process, it's been sort of a unique year and not a traditional year. And so I think that there's going to be some movement and some, after April 10th, a lot of schools that will continue to look at applicants, depending on the size of the school and where they're located.
Yeah. And, some of these kids are making decisions based on not even visiting the school at all. And for a postgrad, that's not that big a deal. I say, look, you're gone for 9 months. You've got YouTube channels, you've got virtual tours, you've got the websites are all beautiful for these prep schools. They're very, they spend a lot of money on multimedia, so you can get a good gist of it. And mind you, this as well as I do. A lot of these prep schools are beautiful, right? Mm-hmm. And one thing I tell my kids is, look, pick the prep school for your postgrad year based on your relationship with the coach, right? Academics are all going to be great, better probably than your public school. The dorms are going to be fine. Gym's going to be fine. Food's going to be fine. Academics are going to be, like we just discussed, you'll be able to potentially take college classes. But for my clientele of postgrad kids, the most important part I say is pick it based on your coach, because in this new COVID environment, you're going to need their advocacy more than ever, right? And actually, I'd say 95% of the kids I placed in prep schools last year, they didn't get to visit. And actually, batting 100%, all of them are happy as clams when they showed up on campus and saw, what they'd seen on screen in reality. And this year, though, thankfully, I don't know if you've seen this as well, but I've had kids able to take visits, and they'll be modified. One school, I know the kids could only drive around campus in their car with the windows rolled up, and then they met a coach offsite to meet him face. But, are you seeing more of your candidates visiting in person, or are they doing the multimedia, or what are you seeing with that now?
It's sort of a combination of both. I think in a majority of cases, the schools have tried to accommodate and make their campus at least accessible for a tour. Fortunately, because of the way that the private school spring break works, they have 2 weeks typically off in March. So for schools where the students left campus a lot of those boarding schools hosted then students on campus, accepted students on campus for tours of campus and opportunities to meet with faculty. So even that was helpful. I know, for example, a school down in Connecticut, Taft School, offered tours outside. So you met with, an admissions officer or a faculty member. They would take you for a tour around campus. And then also there would be opportunities to meet with other faculty members outside on the campus. So at least you got a sense of the physical setup of the campus and also the community feel, which I think for a lot of kids is a little bit unique. When you're going from a big public school, for example, to a boarding school, you're amazed at the facilities, not only in terms of the athletics, but these science buildings and these art buildings. It's really helpful to be able to understand sort of the physical layout of the campus, because as you become a boarder, and if it's your first time boarding, you want to be able to see yourself in that community and being able to see what the setup is, where you play your sports. I think a lot of families or students look at student athletes go on these campuses, and as you said, it's just amazing what's available to them.
Are your international kids in a normal year, a non-COVID year, will they all visit? Or
no, not all of them on a typical year, just because of the travel constraints and the time differences. For example, if you're coming from Hong Kong or China, it's harder for the international students to come visit. But I think for this particular year, it's really sort of restricted almost all the international kids, unless they're already here at a private day school or boarding school for 7th and 8th grade before heading off.
And have you seen
to boarding school? Yeah,
perfect. Have you seen during this past year, because of COVID, that schools have ramped up their multimedia on their web pages?
Yes. I mean, lot more in terms of podcasts, to emphasis on connecting with individual teachers and programs. To here's what we do well. If you're a school that focuses more on experiential learning, these schools have really sort of focused a lot more money and time and attention on, how to market. And there are some schools that are incredible in terms of how much money and also the resources they put into their websites, and especially this year because of the pressure that's related to it. I mean, the drones, I've never seen so many drone on campus or on their websites, where they can show you literally going down the hallway at some of these schools, to give you a sense of what it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, it's a trope now, the drone footage, the diverse, you have boy, girl, different nationalities, different races all in the video. It's like they're all following the same script, but there are a few that are just very creative. Like I know Salisbury School and Lawrenceville have 2 great videos that show their personality off. And I think if I was between a couple schools and I saw that video, I'd probably want to go to the school based on that video, because it seems like, hey, this place also has a good time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would also say that the videos, the biggest change that I've seen just even in the last 5 years from a media standpoint has been the focus more on the student and marketing directly to the students than to the parents. Previously, much more of it was focused on, okay, mom and dad, and here's why we think your son or daughter would like this school. Now it's direct marketing and focus towards the students. And it makes sense, because they're the ones that ultimately are going to be making this decision with the support of their parents.
Well, that's a question I want to pop in and ask too. In your opinion, or in your experience, do kids make the decision mostly, or do parents make it, or they make it together? What have you seen in your experience?
Well, I mean, there's definitely been a shift in relationship to this. When we grew up, parents were, I would say, much more involved in terms of the final decision for schools, simply because they're writing the check, and I think making sure that they feel it's the right fit. I think now, kids are much more, number one, educated and aware of the differences between the schools because of the media, and because of the information that's provided to them on their websites. But I think that, kids are much more, are driving the process a lot more. I've been surprised as a consultant with the number of families that would sit down with me and they would say, Jenny is the one that's initiated this process. So she's the one that came to us and said, I'm unhappy with what's going on in the public school, or I don't feel like I'm being challenged, or I need more support. And so that's probably the biggest shift that's taken place, has been, I think, more student driven than it has been parent driven.
Interesting. I've had a little bit of a mix of that. The kids is in charge fully,
Mm-hmm.
and that's fine. One instance last year, I had a kid hooked up with a couple New England prep schools, and then out of the blue, he committed to a basketball academy. Right?
Wow.
And I was like, oh, all right. And then the dad and I talked, and the dad's like, yeah, he's not going there. We need to make it so he thinks he's making the decision to not go there anymore and go to the New England prep school. And then, after a few days of me and him talking to the kid, he, realized his rash decision and ended up signing with a New England prep school. And it was a very good situation for him. So it can backfire at times. But then when you got a smart dad like that, said, hey, I want to make his own decisions, but he's not going to run into a burning house either without a little bit of guidance. So.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Corey, too. That's a lot of times later in the process, when the family has narrowed down their choices to schools that they're applying to, I'll have conversations, pretty candid conversations in terms of the differences between the schools, so that the parents can really sort of understand clearly what are the benefits, or what are the areas that maybe that school can and can't address with their son or daughter. So, I think working with a consultant from that degree also helps, because a consultant can sort of look from a higher perspective and say, you know what, you may like that school for that reason, but here are some of the benefits from a college standpoint, to size of classes, to the community itself, that may, cause a family to sort of look at a school in a different way.
And that's a great example. So where I work with athletics, and mostly basketball, is, while these prep schools might have different academic profiles, different locations where some might be urban, some might be rural, they've got different coaching personalities, right? Which you have to take into account too. And they have different styles of play as well. Certain teams have 10 D1 guys, certain teams might have one D3 guy, and you've got everything in between, right? So if I'm a parent blindly just reaching out to prep schools based on what an AAU coach knows, or a trainer, or where a friend's kid went, you're shooting blind in the dark that that's going to be the best fit for your goals, right? And you might waste a lot of time, waste a lot of travel trips, waste admission application fees, and you might ultimately make the wrong decision. But like I said, 99% of people in the basketball world don't use a consultant, and it'd be amazing if these guys ended up in the right fits. I think the kids would be happier, families would be happier, the coaches, the schools would be happier. So I just hope everyone makes the right decision out there.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the key parts of the process, that depending on the sport that the student plays, that the boy or girl plays in this process, for my experience, having coached basketball and worked at boarding schools for most of my life, the coaches definitely make a big difference, because if they're involved, and not only as a coach, they're typically what we call triple threats. So they're a coach, they're a teacher, they're involved some way in residential life or weekend activities. A lot of that happens at the boarding school, in the boarding school community. And so the coach really plays a much bigger role than you might see, a history teacher who's not the coach, simply because they're going to see them, both in the classroom, on the basketball court, and in the dormitories. And so that three-pronged approach, I think, sometimes can make a huge difference for parents when they're trying to make a decision, and when the students are trying to make a decision on the right school.
Absolutely. Now, if a kid's down to 3 schools, price is all even, do you tell the kid, hey, you need to go to this school, or do you let them make their choice, or how do you handle that?
Yeah, I let them make their choice, but I'll assist if they have questions specifically about, like, for example, college placement. I think it's important for families to understand that where their students are going to play basketball, for example, their coaches have a track record with university placement and understanding where these kids are going to colleges, and are acting as advocates after, when they're in their 11th grade year, starting to put together a school list of colleges. The coach is going to be the one that's key in that process. And I always tell families, ask, number one, about where your top college players are going. Do you have a track record? Do you have direct communication with the coaches at these universities. And then the second is just to make sure, number one, that the coach is going to be involved and be able to communicate with the teachers at that school where the student's going. Because you don't want a coach that's just seeing him on the basketball court. You want a coach that's going to know, okay, he has a big exam coming up. I need to make sure that my kids are getting on the team are getting the support that they need, in addition to playing a highly competitive schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. And just how I work it is, if I've got a kid talking to 3 schools and he's got accepted to all 3, they might say, where would you send your kid, Corey? Or where should Johnny go? And I'll say, if you go to any of these schools, you're gonna have a great option. It really just comes down to which is the best fit for you and which coach do you want to be in the foxhole with. So once again, if all things are pretty much even, I really, once again, revert back to it. And I've changed it. I used to not be this way, but now even more with COVID and with college placement, you've got to go to a coach that you feel like is, you bond with, because you're going to be with them in skill workouts and practices. He's going to be determining your playing time, and he's going to be the guy calling a college coach on your behalf and advocating for you. So that to me has really changed over the past year and a half. And, the best news for me, Chris, is when a family goes, we've got 3 options. We love all 3. We don't know which one. And to me, I know that's a stressful situation for them, but to me, that's music to my ears because they have 3 great choices. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, that tells the story itself, because the family, in terms of the results and being able to have choices that are strong as well. I mean, and that's also where the financial aid process is helpful. Your knowledge of financial aid and understanding how that works, I think, plays a big role as well. And coaches will be pretty aware or understand how that works in terms of the balance between playing basketball, but also working with the financial aid office at these schools is also really important.
Well, let's get into financial aid right now, because that's usually the $1 million question, literally, or the $65,000 question if we're talking prep school tuition. First of all, can you explain the difference between financial need-based tuition and then financial need-based plus merit? Explain that, because there are 2 school options kids can reach out to, and some might waste their time going down the wrong rabbit hole if they're middle class or just explain the difference.
I mean, so for most families going through this process, number one, there's a difference between an athletic scholarship, which is exclusive to colleges and universities that are able to give scholarships based on athletics, where they get a full scholarship. So if you're playing, football and you're going to University of Nebraska, their scholarships, they have 60 scholarships on that football team and another 30 walk-ons, at that school. It's different in private schools. And the reason it's different is because it's need-based financial aid. I mean, it's the one challenge I find sometimes with families that are going to schools is they misinterpret financial aid for a scholarship, and they tell another family, oh, I got a scholarship from them for basketball. And really it starts with the submission of the financial aid forms, going through the process as a part of the application process, which is usually the parent financial statement. And that's filled out. It's the same forms that you would fill out if you're applying to a college. And it's evaluated, and they come back with a recommendation to all of the schools that give an idea of how much a family would qualify for. And then the schools will interpret that information. The boarding schools will interpret that information based on what they feel like the student qualifies for, but more importantly, where they feel like what support they can provide in terms of the financial aid award. So it's not uncommon for a financial aid award from one school to vary by $10,000 to $15,000 versus another school. And so the big difference is that at that point in the process, and again, we'll talk a little bit about the other options that are available, but in terms of the financial aid process, Corey, I think what they do is I encourage families to stay in communication directly with the financial aid office and communicate with them in regards to what documents they need, to what the awards are, and then have conversations with the financial aid offices about what families feel like they can afford and how the school might be able to help them.
Let me ask you this. When you fill out your financial aid form online, where you put in your tax statements, your assets, when parents fill out that whole snapshot, it's my understanding that that computer program within a few days will produce a number to the prep schools and say the family can pay this. And for this conversation, let's say the family can pay $50,000. Am I wrong in thinking that certain schools take that number and that's it?
Yes, there are some that based on the way that their financial aid protocol is and how they evaluate financial aid families, applicants. Yes, sometimes there are schools that are say this is the number that we think you can pay based on the financial aid forms and the number that was indicated on the form. Parents also can ask for that number to be sent to them at the same time that the schools get it. I don't think a lot of parents realize that, but you can ask for them to send a copy of that financial aid award or what they're recommending that you could pay on the form to the families as well as to the schools. And then they interpret that information.
Absolutely. So there's families that say you come from a family with a single parent, you don't make much money, they're going to qualify for a lot of financial aid.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a family with a lot of wealth, that number might not even matter because you can write a check for $65,000. The challenge comes for, middle income families that make just enough, but, and they might get a package that says, hey, congratulations, you're going to pay $35,000 to go to this prep school. And you and I know that's $30K off most,
Right.
But it's still way more than the average American can afford to spend for that year. So what do you say to middle class families that kind of fall in the middle?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably the biggest challenge for boarding schools is maintaining a certain level of support, financial aid, and increasing their financial aid to be able to address the expanding middle class, because tuitions have risen at a higher level than, say, salaries. And so as a result of that, I think schools have to be more aware and more flexible in terms of being able to offer specifically to the middle class families with multiple children. Even if you're a dual income family, if you're paying $60,000, let's say $62,000 is a average boarding tuition, schools are cognizant of the fact that the average family, middle class family, cannot afford that. And as a result, they're trying to, number one, support them with larger financial aid budgets, but also encouraging families to pursue other options that are available. Some schools will offer merit scholarships. And that's, I know, one of the questions that you wanted to talk about.
Well, let's talk about that. So for certain kids in the middle class, when I take them on as clients, I won't even reach out to the schools that are all need-based, right? Because that number is going to be too high. So I want to work with a school that looks at that number, but then has merit to offer based on their academics, how good that is, because schools give money for that, based on their athletic ability, because coaches have a say in that. And maybe they're from a country or part of the U.S. that's not well represented there. So, maybe they speak multiple languages. Maybe they play an instrument at a high level. So you do this as well as I do. I create a narrative to these schools saying, hey, here's Johnny, the financial spreadsheet might say they can afford to pay $40,000, but due to life and due to all these other things the kid can bring to the school, they're really only looking to invest $20,000. Let me know your thoughts. So explain to me how a school works merit into maybe a kid that comes from a middle income family.
Yeah, so it really depends on the school and their sort of willingness to support merit scholarships. Some schools are very clear that they don't offer merit scholarships, but they offer financial aid or need-based financial aid. Again, a lot of those schools that just say we can only offer need-based financial aid are flexible. In other words, you can go back to them and say, we were offered this amount, $25,000. Another school has offered us more. Is there, you're our first choice. Is there an ability or opportunity here for you to meet the same offer to increase the financial aid similar to the other school in order to allow us to make this happen? So that would be without the merit scholarship. Other schools will say based on individual talents that student brings, they offer merit scholarships. I don't see a lot of schools that offer more than, say, like a $10,000 merit scholarship, depending on the circumstances. But I do think that schools are willing to negotiate, and especially with the high tuitions right now at these schools and the talent level and the expanding middle class. As a result of that, I think, if you go back to a school or indicate, I like to have, families communicate directly with the person that they interviewed with, as well as the director of financial aid, to be able to be very clear about, this financially is a struggle for us. Is there anything else that you can do? And if a school has a merit scholarship, I would ask that question at the beginning of the admissions process, so that you don't get into a situation where, oh, I thought you would have a merit scholarship available. Most of the schools will be very clear whether they offer merit scholarships at the beginning of the process. And then from there, you can use that as a way to determine whether there's more available. I think a lot of families just assume that if they receive their financial aid award on March 10th, that's it. The process is over. They have to accept that award. And that's not necessarily the case. Having been a director of financial aid, I've had families come in where we've gone through every financial document on the parent financial statement, and was able to determine that they qualified for more based on other factors. And schools will also look, Corey, at this and say, this student is, what contributions is this student going to make to our community? And that is clearly also a part of this process from a merit standpoint, so that a school is going to be more willing to give a merit scholarship to a student who's going to contribute beyond just playing basketball. Maybe they're going to play 2 sports. Maybe they're one of the top students in their class. They're coming from South America, and would offer diversity to our school population. So that's something that clearly schools will take into consideration. It's just a question of how much merit scholarships are available and how many schools are going to offer it. But I do think that families need to be more cognizant of the fact that financial aid goes all the way through the spring and summer.
If it's still available.
If it's still available, right.
And that's the thing too.
A lot of schools are making it more available.
Okay. And then in COVID, is there more financial aid? Is there about the same? Is there less?
No, it's I would say it's less, but I think schools have taken, like, I know, for example, a couple of schools created what they call emergency financial aid funds for returning students.
Mm-hmm.
So that if a family's financial situation changed due to COVID, where if a parent lost a job or they were unable to pay a certain amount of the tuition, the schools have created a separate budget or line item to make sure that they can guarantee those students come back without having to take it away from the normal or their usual financial aid budget for the following year for new students.
Gotcha. And I want to pipe in here and talk about basketball coaches. So a lot of schools I work with, the coaches will have maybe 1 to 7 scholarships, right? And that's $65K. They can put towards one kid. They can spread it out amongst their roster. It's almost like major league where you've got a salary cap and you've got to divvy it up and figure out how to make your team. And, when I reach out to a school, I've had a conversation with the family beforehand about the finances. Some kids I can say, hey, this kid doesn't need any financial aid. And that gives them more options because coaches don't have to use it on them. Other kids I might say, hey, this kid is this height. He's got this great GPA. He's got these D1 offers. He also plays clarinet. Both parents might have money, but his value he brings to a school, can get him merit, right? Mm-hmm. An example I give on that is I had a kid apply to 3 New England prep schools, all 3 good basketball programs. He's a D1 player. He's 6'4", minority, 1,000-point scorer. Family is in the medical profession. They've got good money, but he also is going to be playing D1 one day, maybe in the NCAA tournament. So based on how good he is, a couple schools didn't give him aid because his family didn't qualify, but a third school gave him a great package, actually less than he was willing to pay, because they saw the value he brought, right? And if that kid's shooting in the dark, not picking the right schools, he might have wasted a whole, 8 months trying to find a prep school, right? Another example I want to give is I've got a kid now I'm working with who had $20,000 to put towards prep school. And this kid's a D1 player. He's 6'2", a star point guard, star quarterback at his little school, started a couple clubs, volunteered, 4.2 GPA, had high academic D3s on him. And he's going to probably go to a prep school where he said he could pay 20. They want him so bad. They said, you've only got to pay 10. We need you right now. So just so you know, like, you've got to know, like, one, the max amount you're willing to spend on a prep school year. That's usually the hardest part of any conversation I initially have with a family is getting through that financial part of the conversation. And one of the things I also get to is, hey, I want a basketball scholarship at a prep school and then go play D1 and play in the NBA. And like you said, those don't exist. So I just want to educate people on like how this process works.
Right.
You really need to be up to snuff on these details. Cause just like you, Chris, you're talking to admission directors every week. You're talking to financial aid guys. So the current status at certain schools who have money for certain kids, who doesn't, who still has spots available, who doesn't. And I do the same thing with basketball coaches. I'm talking every day to multiple coaches. Who still needs a big? Who's got money? Do you like this guard? You want him to pursue, and apply. All of that is going on because that is the world we live in. And I just cannot stress it enough. If you're coming in blindly trying to navigate this world, I just can't imagine. And the example I give is, I bring a lot of players from Taiwan over. Well, if I was going to send my kid to a high school in Taiwan to play basketball, I would have no idea.
Right.
I know Taipei and maybe I'd know the best junior high school program, but is that the right fit? Can I afford it? Is there maybe a better fit for him, both academically, and on and on and on. So I know this is going to sound a little bit like an infomercial, but Chris and I, we've drank the Kool-Aid because we lived it, right? Chris,
right.
I went to prep school. We're in this world every day. And absolutely, you can do it on your own, right? Just like you can represent yourself in court on your own, or you can hire someone that does this every single day in this specific discipline, who knows the judge, who knows the other attorneys, who knows how this goes in the past. That's the example I give. And do lawyers cost money? They do, but they could save you money in the long run, or, potentially change your life for the better. So
exactly. I mean, it's sort of like the way we've talked before. You're really providing advice and coaching to this family in a process that maybe is very foreign and very difficult to navigate. And so I've found, like, one of the biggest changes that's taken place, Corey, and this as well, is, books, additional costs and fees that go along with boarding schools where it's their first time going to a boarding school. A lot of schools now are including books, transportation, maybe 1 or 2 airline tickets, depending on the circumstances and the needs of the family. And so that's something that's really important to take into consideration as well. I have families that have no idea that, for example, that once the tuition has been paid, there's still an additional, $2,000 that needs to go towards books, towards weekend activities, towards technology fees for each of these schools. And that's something that schools are becoming aware of and how important that is. And so from our perspective, that's where we can help in terms of saying, okay, here's what the family's able to contribute. What other ways can you help them in terms of making this transition, because their son or daughter is going to make that big of an impact on your school?
So in that situation, would you say, like, hey, if a family can pay $20K for everything, would you say this family can pay $20K all in to include books, transportation, computer, insurance?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if that's something that they're comfortable with in terms of that number, definitely. I also would take into consideration that the schools, when you have that conversation with the schools after they've been accepted, that's where you can go back to a school and say, thanks for the offer. Here's what we mapped out in terms of what we feel like we can afford. And I think that's really the responsibility of the financial aid directors and their officers, to be able to understand that there are circumstances that they can't necessarily take into consideration, that they have to look at.
Yeah.
And it's cost of living to, a kid coming from Canada in a school there where the tuitions are much cheaper or the cost of living is much less, and then coming here, and how that translates in terms of weekend expenses or other expenses that are incorporated in the tuition. I do think that there's definitely a way to negotiate, and that's where, as a consultant from your standpoint and my standpoint, to be able to provide that insight rather than letting the family navigate that on their own, which can be overwhelming, makes a huge difference.
And that saves money right there on that. This is one thing too, and you'll probably agree with me on this. This is why you want to apply to more than just one school, so you can potentially negotiate tuitions with the other ones. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with it. I mean, that's also one of the reasons why each of these schools has sort of a different, sometimes philosophical approach to their financial aid and how they distribute it. And so when they're looking at a particular student, they may say, if we could tap into this market where there are great families coming from, this particular area of the country, it may be more helpful this year to help that family than it would be in another year, and it may open up a whole new market, for that school. I mean, I've seen it with schools that have really strong soccer programs, for example, and they'll go down to new markets in South America or South Africa, and as a result of that, they're able to give financial aid awards to these student athletes that are soccer players, and then it opens up a whole new market for them, and also it gives them, I mean, ultimately the bottom line is those kids are going to end up going to better colleges and universities because of what they're bringing to the school and the talents that they're bringing from an athletic standpoint.
Absolutely. I've seen that happen before when I bring a kid over from a foreign country. Somehow word spreads, and that school now has a couple applicants from that country that I didn't introduce them to, but it just through word of mouth. Let me ask you this. So, and without naming names, an offer from one maybe higher esteemed prep school where presidents and senators have gone, they might not lower their price to appeal a lesser named prep school. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, you may find that the schools will basically say, we've got a large enough applicant pool and we're competitive enough that we don't have to necessarily go the extra length in relationship to adding more financial aid, to the pot at this point, versus another school that student may make a bigger impact and may have may have more options in terms of playing on their varsity, but also making getting into a better college. It just depends on the school. But yes, the top tier schools aren't necessarily as as needy in relationship to offering financial aid or support to certain families, just because they have a much larger applicant pool.
But if a school, a smaller tier school, sees that some kid has gotten into an Andover and Exeter, well, they might throw a little bit more aid their way to get a kid, and they have bragging rights like, hey, this kid could have gone to Exeter or Andover, one of those schools. He chose to come here. Let's give him a little bit more money, and
Yep. No, I would agree with that. I mean, there are schools that are merit scholarships, for example. A lot of like a St. Paul's school up in New Hampshire has merit scholarships. And so they can use that to their advantage, because they can take students that are the top, say a top student athlete coming from a particular school that maybe doesn't even, maybe qualifies for a little financial aid, but because they have a merit scholarship and because they have such an outstanding academic reputation and college placement, they're able to use that merit scholarship to lure a kid who might go to another school that might not be quite as strong academically, and then and it's a whole new experience. So it could be a minority student, for example, that's coming from an inner city, that's the top student in their class, who's also a 2 or 3 sport athlete, who normally would not have even considered applying to a school like a St. Paul's or an Andover or an Exeter. And because of the fact that they have those resources available to them, that can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this. What are some tips that say a kid's applying to prep school, he's going through interviews, he's going through the admissions process. Any tips you can give that might help them, or errors you've seen kids make in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say errors, but I think the important part of this, the process is, number one, being upfront in terms of, the interview, and a lot of kids sometimes will um, ask for help or get help on their essays. For
Mm.
example, it's one of the circumstances where I've been in situations where it's pretty clear that a student's gotten some help from someone else on their application in their essays. And as an admissions committee or an admissions officer who's got experience, they would pick up on this pretty quickly.
Hmm.
And so even as a consultant, I've had a family that, a student that has gone through the process, and the director of admissions has gotten back to me and said, the application writing seems inconsistent. So it looks like they've got a little help from someone else. And when they match that up with the writing sample, for example, on the SSAT, the standardized testing, that can really work against them. And so that's an easy way, or a pretty clear way, that students sometimes overlook, or families overlook. They feel like, okay, dad and mom can help with the essays. I think that there's some help that's being provided, but it's purely, I would let the students write the essays rather than asking for input. And that's sometimes hard for parents that are very involved in their kids' education.
Yeah. Especially with today's helicopter parents. So
Yes, exactly. The other one is during interviews. I've found kids can sometimes reveal their hand a little bit too soon.
tell me about that.
Yeah. So if you're looking at, let's say, 5 or 6 schools, and the schools are always interested in learning about where else the kids are applying, where else they're looking at schools. And I've had a couple of experiences where students have told the admissions officer where they're looking at their schools and what school is their preference. And if it's not the school that you're interviewing with, that can obviously work against you. And so, for families, I definitely say you want to be honest in saying that you're looking at other schools, but you don't want to say, oh, we've got this school as the top of our list, and you're second or third on that list. That's not going to work to their favor, and the school's not going to respond favorably to that.
Yeah. And coaches ask that too. In fact, an example I'll give is just this past couple of months, I had a kid looking at 2 schools, and he was talking to one coach, like, so where do you think you're going? He's like, well, the money's around, I'm going to the other school. And that coach said, oh, okay, well, we're done here. And just
That's right. That just ends the whole application process.
But this school was $20,000 cheaper.
Yep.
And he had to do he had to go back and say, hey, I didn't mean that. I'm looking at both schools. And sure enough, when March 10th came, that kid's package came in $20K cheaper. And he's like, you know what, coach, I'm sorry, but I want to go back to you. So yeah, it's holding your cards close to your chest and not giving everything away. And that's where you and I come in on having to coach these kids and just say, hey, just be very diplomatic, very vanilla. Don't give everything away, and just see, hey, I'm going to wait and see what the packages are, and then we'll go from there.
Right. Yeah. And then the other side, I would just say quickly, Corey, is the importance of follow-up from both the parents and the students is important. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to write a personal thank you note. I mean, I think in the age of technology now, with the internet, follow-up notes to admissions interviews, to coaches, make a big difference. I don't think that they necessarily understand that in terms of the process, but if you can follow up, for example, on an interview and saying thank you, that they can personalize it and demonstrate why they feel like that school is a good fit for them, just in a brief note, an email, I think makes a big difference and shows that the student is committed and involved in this process, rather than, oh, I'm going to go to the best school based on their basketball or football program. They're invested in it because they know that the school is doing their research on him as well, or her. And to be able to write a note, follow up, to the coach, saying thanks for spending the time, I appreciate it, and then be able to maintain that connection through the admissions process makes it much easier for them, as well as the coaches and the admissions office.
Absolutely. And 2 stories on that. One, in 13 years, I got my first handwritten thank you note from a kid yesterday.
Wow.
In the mail. First time ever.
13 years.
13 years. And you know what?
It's amazing.
But that kid's also worked every summer of high school, and that money he's made working is going towards his prep school tuition.
Mm-hmm.
So that kid's going to be just fine in life.
Right.
And secondly, there's a family friend we have who has a scholarship at a major university, and it's like a $5,000 scholarship. And not every year it's used, but when a kid does use it and they write a handwritten thank you note for the scholarship, this person sends them another $1,000 check saying, hey,
that's awesome.
You just congratulations for getting the scholarship. And just because you're going above and beyond, here's just a little help for a college kid. And just a reminder that, just like you said, thank you notes will potentially pay huge dividends in life.
Yeah. And even in the, I explain this to families that I work with, that even in that, when you're in the interview process or in the admissions process, to be able to, there's a note, you can't communicate at certain times with coaches. I think it's from February, for the month of February. For certain schools, you can't directly communicate with coaches, like in terms of them recruiting you or calling you. But you can like email and just update and say, hey, coach, just wanted to reach out, let you know how I'm doing. For a student that is, you know, a good student, but maybe, you know, needs to continue to share more about himself or herself in terms of their progress, I recommend for families always, or for the student, to email at the beginning of February or mid-February, just to say, you know, to the admissions officer, hi, I just wanted to update you on how how things are going. I achieved this academically. Our team is doing well, and I'm still really interested in your school. And that makes it makes a really positive impact, because when they have these committee meetings, that's something that they look at is this student interested in us, and how have they responded to you after interviewing?
That's great advice. Great advice. A couple more things to talk about here. You worked at Allegheny, right?
I didn't work at Allegheny. No, I worked at Salisbury.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing we discussed in the past is about if you're a college and you've got, an example I use is clones. Same student, same academic profile. They look the same height, same skills, but one kid goes to a prep school and one kid goes to a public school. Who is a college going to gravitate towards more? And, you know, we discussed this recently. You said majority of the time they're going to take the prep school kid. Explain why that would be the case. Yeah.
So, the history, number one, of private schools and these boarding schools, specifically in New England, just from my experience living in Boston, is they were created as sort of pre-prep, as a way to prep for college, for the most competitive colleges. And so the idea is that while public schools, and there are excellent public schools all over the country, I'm not trying to make a point that public schools aren't good. It's just the emphasis on academics, the emphasis on extracurricular activities that are available at a boarding school, for example, and the opportunity to be in an environment where other kids from different backgrounds go to school that share sort of the same academic level of interest and focus. Colleges appreciate that. And so they know, for example, historically, that kids that are coming out of these boarding schools tend to be better prepared. And it's more about time management. So for the kid that's coming out of a public school where they have a class of 40 students or 30 students in their, let's say, an English class, you're going into a private school, you're in a class of 12 to 15 max at these schools, and some even smaller. And so as a result, the expectation level for kids that are going into these private schools, because they're selective, because they're more expensive, the expectation level is higher. And so for a lot of these colleges, especially for some of the top schools, the expectation level is that kids that are coming out of these boarding schools are better prepared and have better balance, because they've taken arts, because they've been involved in leadership, because they're expected to be involved in community service as a part of their graduation requirement. And so as a result, a kid that maybe has zero interest in volunteering or community service or getting involved in leadership, all of a sudden has that opportunity given to them at a boarding school. And as a result of that, they end up being able to manage their time and contribute, I think, in more ways in college than you might be able to in a school where you just don't have that option available.
Gotcha. And you mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, there's 350 boarding schools in the U.S. And there's 100 of them that offer post-grad. Does that go across the spectrum of boarding schools as well, where some are higher tiered than others? And some might get, if you're a clone, once again, at one of the higher schools versus maybe a middle tier school, is the guy or girl at the higher end school going to have a heads up over maybe a middle tier prep school kid?
It's a tough argument because for some schools, if you're, for example, looking at some of the bigger schools, there are some schools, for example, like a Choate, that have 30 postgraduates on an average year. They're coming in for 1 year. And so the level of competition is pretty high for those postgraduate spots. But a lot of those kids are already being recommended to schools for colleges prior to coming to a postgraduate year. And it's one of the reasons they're going is because a college basketball coach or a college football coach has said, we really like him, but academically he's not up to par, or the standardized testing is not up to par. We'd like him to get an extra year. And that makes a huge difference. And so there is definitely an advantage to the top schools in terms of where they're sending their kids to colleges. But on the other side of it, I think for the smaller schools that have PGs, those kids are sort of the big fish in the small pond, and they can make a bigger impact as a PG at some of those smaller schools than they might necessarily if they're one of 20 or 25 at a larger boarding school. So they're really sort of both ways to look at it, from that standpoint. I tend to feel like, the top schools with the PGs know pretty much what the expectation level is for those PGs when they come in. We need to get them, academically on track. We need to get a couple more AP classes, or we need to get their standardized test scores up 150 points. And then they can go to this college and this college, which already has identified them. Whereas at another school, you might say for a PG, they know they're a really good athlete. They need to have more exposure in terms of the athletic competition. And with colleges, that's going to allow them to compete at a higher level than they would have if they went right into college out of public school.
Yeah, and that was more of an academic question there. For basketball, it really depends on each individual kid and where they're coming from, right? Do they need to be on a team where they're the man? Do they want to be on a team with 9 other D1 players where they're battling every day in practice, maybe not playing as much in games? So that's something I help families with, like figuring out, do you want to be the man? Do you want to be one of 10? Or do you want to be at a nice mix in between? Here's the pros and cons of each. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a big difference between going to a school where you have 20 kids trying out for the varsity basketball team versus 35 to 40, and then if you've got a bench that has 7 or 8 kids on your team that are going Division I, you may not see as much time as a result of that. And so I think you're right to sort of emphasize the fact, and that's where, from a consulting standpoint, we try to recommend a range of schools where you can say, all right, I try to say, all right, here are 2 schools that are absolute stretches for you to look at. Here are 2 or 3 schools that are right on target. And then maybe here's a school that we would typically say as a backup or a safety in that process, but all have sort of the strong programs in terms of the athletic match. It's just a question of being able to know the program and understanding the coach and getting a fairly clear understanding of how much you're going to play.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your favorite movie?
So I would have to say Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I like the Westerns.
Good choice. Classic. What about the best country you've ever visited?
Best country. I would say Hong Kong.
Okay.
It's so diverse. There's so much there. It's incredible. Also, I don't think a lot of people appreciate the natural beauty over there in relationship to places you can go sailing or hiking. It's just incredible how much is at your fingertips in Hong Kong.
Nice. Last meal on earth. What's it going to be?
Last meal?
Meal.
Oh, meal. Oh,
Kentucky
definitely.
accent coming out.
I would say surf and turf, lobster and steak.
Oh, I was going to think sardines and chicken. So, well, this is good. Chris, I love talking to you. I learned so much every time you and I chat, because usually I'm calling you with a complicated question or, need advice on this or that. And I think this is great information for people that are curious about, a little bit more about the prep school world and do they need a consultant or not? And I always say, hey, reach out to me. I'll let you know real quick if this is an option or not. And if it is, we can talk further, but I'm not going to steer you wrong. If prep school is not a good option, you're not good enough, or the grades aren't there, the finances don't make sense, I'm not going to waste your time through that process. But if it does make sense, Chris and I can put you guys or girls in front of the right fitting prep schools. And it's insurance is the way I look at it. People buy insurance in case something goes wrong. I consider myself an insurance policy to where, you're going to be spending money and time at a prep school. Let's make sure of all these 350 out there, we're getting in front of the right couple ones that pick me. And selfishly, Chris, I wish there was people like us in other industries, like healthcare. We're trying to pick a policy is confusing, trying to get stuff done on my house. I know there's general contractors, but I wish I had someone that, knew exactly what I was thinking and had experience. So that's my thoughts. Do you have any final thoughts after our conversation today?
No, I think that, number one, the service the support you're providing and what we're providing is really sort of advocacy as well as helping kids. And that's one of the things that I try to emphasize with families that are really competitive is, okay, this is about your son or daughter and making that connection and making sure they're going to the right school where they can be successful. And I think that's where, as consultants, we can help in the process. The other thing I would just say is, as a consultant, I always tell families, you're welcome to just have a consultation with me and then decide after your consultation, what you want to do and how I can help. And if I'm the right fit, I always tell families, you want to make sure that your son or daughter is comfortable working with me.
Yeah.
And I think obviously with your experience and your understanding of this, it's really important to make those connections with the kids as well as the parents.
Yeah. And you and I have both lived it. So we can both speak from experience on how it's benefited our lives.
Absolutely.
Where can people find you online?
At Hunnewell Education Group. It's Chris at HunnewellEducation.com. And we are located and we have offices in Boston as well as in Natick, Massachusetts. And, we look forward to, continuing to help students through this process.
Yeah. And I'll put all of Chris's contact information in the show notes. And if you like this and like other prep school talk, be sure to subscribe. We're on all the podcasting platforms. We're on YouTube. Go to my website, prepathletics.com, and join the newsletter if you want to stay more up to date on everything going on. But once again, this was Chris Overbye of Hunnewell Education out of Boston, one of the foremost experts out there. Great guy, has lived it, lives on prep school campuses, is working on sending his daughter to one too. So you're actually you just heard a pretty good conversation. And any more questions you have, you can always email me or email Chris, and we'll do the best we can to help you out. So thank you very much for joining the Prep Athletics podcast. We'll see you next time.
Take care.